Welcome to the Wheels Football Onslaught podcast, the second episode now. I appreciate everybody who tuned in for the first one just a couple of weeks ago. I appreciate all the love and support I've been getting, whether that was online or off of the social platforms. I appreciate everybody who's been giving my content a listen to, and I appreciate everyone that's tuning into the podcast now. So I'm your host, Will. And every week I'm going to be diving headfirst into the biggest stories, drama, and debates in the Premier League and also the rest of the top European leagues as well. There's no holding back, just sharp opinions and honest takes. And what a week of football for us to dive into yet again. Today on Will's Football Onslaught podcast, we've got the explosive resignation of Daniel Levy at Spurs, record-breaking transfer deadline day, including Liverpool's mouth-watering deal for Alexander Isak, and also Lionel Messi's emotional farewell in Argentina, plus a fascinating look at how different players have been handling this summer window that's just gone by. This episode is fired up. Let's get straight into it. So now, to kick things off, we're going to go with the biggest headlines that have been dominating the football chatter and forums over the past week in football. And to be honest with you, you just got to trust me on this one. There is no shortage of drama and on and off the pitch, explosiveness, people getting into arguments, people not agreeing with this and that. There's so much for us to tuck into. So let's get into it right away. So now, looking at the biggest stories that have been making waves so far, we've got Daniel Levy, who just resigned from his position as executive chairman at Spurs. Now, at the time of the recording, this news had just broken over the past day. It's something that came out of the blue, if I'm being honest with you. And I have to say, there's no shortage of mixed reactions to this. You've got a seismic shift that's now going to be taking place in North London. Spurs are a club that just before these past few months, they had been on a 17-year trophy drought. The previous trophy before that was a Carabao Cup, a trophy that doesn't necessarily get as much of the pedigree as the likes of winning a Premier League or a European trophy or even an FA Cup. So over the last 25 years, Spurs fans had been starved of real prominent success until Ange Postecoglou had just led them to their Europa League triumph, the third one all time, but the first since the rebrand from the UEFA Cup to the Europa League. Now, with Daniel Levy, he exits following, you could also argue, mixed success, as well as mixed reactions. I've seen many Spurs fans, a number of you of whom I know personally and have been speaking to me as well. So many of you have been giving me nothing but positive reactions to this. A lot of you have been acting like Christmas Day came early with this news. And some of you I've even seen react the same way you reacted to winning the Europa League trophy. And that just goes to show how much of a figure of discontent and frustration that Daniel Levy had become over the years during his tenure at Spurs. It's important to remember he'd been at the club for 25 years. At the moment, he resigns as the longest serving executive in that role in the Premier League over the last, let's just say, modern century, the 21st century. So he was the only one who had been in this role for anywhere near this length of time. And now you've got, under Daniel Levy, there's a lack of sporting success. You've got Spurs winning the two trophies that I just mentioned, the Carabao Cup and now just most recently the Europa League. But they did have huge off-field success, and I think that needs to be pointed out. They've brought in a brand new state-of-the-art stadium that had been in the works for a long time. They've bought up land in and around the area. They have, improved infrastructure in and around the area as well to help fans get into the area, to help, I'd say, brighten up and aesthetically pleasing the area of Tottenham as well, in and around the stadium. Having a state-of-the-art stadium is really great for bringing in a lot more money. You've seen Spurs become a regular host of a number of big concerts for huge artists, both locally and internationally, over the last few years. We've seen Spurs' ground become quite a common away stadium for NFL matches when they're coming over to the UK to have their international games as well. But at the end of the day, it just has to be said, Spurs fans want success on the pitch, the same as any other club's fan base. It's nice to be having all this money coming in and generating all this revenue, But then when it doesn't translate to success on the pitch, trophies being won, trophies being put in the cabinet, you're always going to have frustrated fans who aren't going to cherish as much of the off-field success as maybe they could do. So with this now being the state of Spurs at the moment, even though they've become financially stronger over the years, they've become more of a global brand under Daniel Levy. He should get some credit for that. But where were the trophies? Spurs usher in a fresh leadership era that is going to have Peter Charrington as the non-executive chairman at the club and CEO Vinay Venkatesham taking the helm. Formerly used to work in the boardroom at Arsenal not too long ago, North London rivals. Now, moving on from this, you've also got madness that had been happening on transfer deadline day. Just at the start of this week, we had the final day of the summer window. And I have to say, it's been a fantastic transfer window to watch unfold. I would say probably 12 or 13 Premier League clubs. I don't think their fan bases can be complaining too much about the transfer business that they're done. But I do look at the likes of Aston Villa, amongst the bottom spenders in the league. It just has to be said, teams like Aston Villa who have European football but didn't spend as much to match that ambition. They did just about miss out on Champions League football as well. They're going to be very frustrated. And they played in Champions League last season, managed to get into the knockout rounds. They're going to be frustrated to not be back there again. I would have liked to have seen even more influx of signings coming in, but you've seen the likes of Marco Asensio ended up going to Fenerbahce, even though Aston Villa tried late on in the window to get that deal done. They've got some other loan deals coming in as well, but that's, just a little side note on Aston Villa. I felt like Aston Villa should have done more. But just staying on topic, insane transfer deadline day moves that happened. You had Alexander Isak to Liverpool for a British transfer record fee of £125 million. Some reports say this fee would go up to £130 million. One of the top journalists in Fabrizio Romano, he has said a bit of a solidarity payment to Newcastle United. I'm assuming for all the trouble that's been caused with all the rumours and the speculation. And of course, the fact that Newcastle United didn't really want to sell Alexander Isak, but they're being slightly forced into the situation of selling him and parting ways with the Swedish striker. So that was a part of a record-breaking summer spend that we've seen all across the Premier League this season. A record spend of about £3 billion have been spent by the Premier League this summer. And if you add up the total spends across the Liga, Serie A, League and the Bundesliga, it doesn't even amount to the amount of money that the Premier League have spent alone. They have now become almost some sort of version of a Super League in itself. The clubs all across the league have so much financial spending power. We've also seen Yoane Wissa move to Newcastle United. He had his own prolonged transfer saga as well, not training with Brentford. Brentford refusing to let him go. They did let go of his fellow frontman, Brandon Mbeumo, early on in the window, but it looked like he wouldn't get his move. But just about on deadline day, he gets that £55 million move to Newcastle United. We've also seen the likes of Randal Kolo Muani join Spurs on a dry loan. There doesn't look like to be any buy option or obligation to buy. And Piero Hincapié, another one that's left by Leverkusen now. I did say on the podcast last time, Bayer Leverkusen had been losing so many players. Now they've also gone and lost another key player in Hincapié. Initially, it's going to be a loan deal, but there looks to be an obligation to buy, which if you add the loan fee and also this €52 million obligation to buy, it should take the total fee quite close to the release clause in Hincapié's contract with Leverkusen. But moving on from deadline day, it's not just the players who got moves, it's also the players who had to stay put. And none more so got the headlines for this type of situation than Marc Guéhi. The Crystal Palace FA Cup winning captain. He was a model professional this summer. He was really, really brilliant in the way that he conducted himself. He had just as much speculation on his name just as any other well-known Premier League player. And I have to say, handled it very well. Everyone knew, because of the reports that just kept flooding in throughout the summer, Liverpool were in pole position to sign Marc Guéhi. They were in the market for a centre-back. They did sign a young centre-back in Giovanni Leone, but he's only a teenager, is totally not experienced at the top level of the game. It did seem like with selling Jarell Quansah, Liverpool were going to need another defensive option as well. Gomez and Ibrahima Konate, we've both seen with them in recent seasons, struggled to consistently stay fit throughout most of the season. So it seemed like Marc Guéhi, an English centre-back, heading into a World Cup year, wants to nail down that starting spot also wants to compete for the biggest honours, despite the fact he won an FA Cup with Crystal Palace last season. It looks like he wanted the move. And the way that I look at it personally, I can't help but feel bad for the guy because he did everything that you would think a professional should do, especially if you're a captain. But with the deal getting to the last sort of stages, he got permission from Crystal Palace to have a medical on deadline day. Liverpool submitted a £35 million bid. They managed to get the deal sheet in just before the deadline. It was up to Crystal Palace to accept it, but they couldn't get in a replacement. There was a report saying that they wanted to get Igor in from Brighton, but West Ham ended up hijacking that move. No centre-back replacement for their captain, which meant Marc Guéhi had to stay put. And it's a shame because just the day before he had this, what we thought was probably going to be his final game as a Crystal Palace player. He scored an absolute screamer from the edge of the box. It was a brilliant curling effort, dipped into the top corner against Aston Villa in that demolition 3-0 victory against them. But in the end, he stays as a Crystal Palace player for now. And now, just lastly, we have a look at Lionel Messi's emotional home farewell in what could be his final competitive match on home soil. Messi scored twice for Argentina. The first goal was the opening of the game, a beautiful lob, with a lot of his teammates being very unselfish, playing towards him, helping him get scoring opportunities. But a player talented as Messi, just give him the ball, he'll do the rest. Brilliant lob from him. He helped create the second goal as well, as he's quickly taken free kick that was played into the box. Ball gets cut in, Lautaro Martinez scored to make it 2-0. Then with 10 minutes left to go, Lionel Messi tapping into an empty net from a really unselfish play from his Argentine teammates. And yeah, it just seemed to be a beautiful farewell story. Not necessarily the last time he's going to play for Argentina. He is expected to be in the World Cup squad, but that isn't confirmed because, as we've seen from reports, he did get some hint as to what his future participation was going to be like. But for the most part, he just kept it a little bit vague, saying that it will be completely dependent on how he feels come the summer of 2026 when the World Cup in the United States will take place. But for now, Argentina, they've played their final World Cup qualifying game. They had already qualified quite a few games ago, and you could tell really from the way that they were playing, despite the fact that they won 3-0 on the day, I would say they played like a team that had already qualified. You know, you could see that there wasn't too much intensity, or there was a little bit of a lack of urgency in the way they were playing that game. But it was a comfortable one. Messi shone, got a brace. Arguably, possibly the last time he'll play a competitive match in front of the home fans. It was a beautiful ending in that regard. But I don't expect that to be the ending of his international career. I expect him to give it one more go to see if he can turn another dream into reality, going back to back in the World Cup. Let's see if he can do that. So now that we've done that, we've had a look at the big headlines now. Now, all of these stories were massive and none really hit quite as hard as the Daniel Levy leaving Spurs one, in my opinion. I think this one was a huge breaking story because as someone who, over the years, I've just been able to meet so many fans that are Spurs fans, you know, in North London. And the reality is a lot of Spurs fans have told me to my face they aren't fans of the way that Daniel Levy has been running the club. So let's just look at a bit more than this one, because this is more than just a headline for Spurs fans. This is something that could be a real turning point for their football club, and I want to break it down properly. So the only thing to really look at is, let's see where Spurs went from under Levy taking over as the chairman to where he now leaves them in 2025. So what's important to know is Daniel Levy isn't a majority stakeholder or owner in the club. He's got shares from the Lewis family, who control the majority of Tottenham Hotspur, and his family with Daniel Levy, they will also have their fair share of their stakehold in the club. It's just that Daniel Levy is going to leave his role as an executive chairman. That's it. He's not necessarily cutting ties with Tottenham Hotspur. Like I said, still has a stake in the club, but his position running the club, that's now over. He's stepping down. I have seen some reports, and I don't know if they're verified, but I have seen some reports that Daniel Levy didn't even know he was going to be resigning until a few hours before Spurs had announced it. So I'm very keen to see what happened in the background. Will we ever get to know? Who knows? Who knows? But I'm very keen to see if Daniel Levy truly wanted to leave or not. Because like I said earlier, he was the longest serving executive in this position in the Premier League. Nobody had this kind of reign over any club for this length of time like Daniel Levy had with Spurs. And I think what's important to remember is Spurs, in terms of the value of the club from when he took over in 2000 as a chairman to where he leaves them, Forbes estimated the value of Spurs in 2000 was £80 million. Spurs are now valued at £2.6 billion as of 2024. I expect that fee, or rather expect that valuation to have increased even more so because they did have some brilliant revenue this past season. I believe over the £500 million mark over the past year. But with Spurs having all of these things like these smart financial deals, like the naming rights to the stadium, the fact that they did build a stadium and such a beautifully well-constructed stadium, you've got this like transformational pitch that can convert into another sort of pitch as well for other sporting events. The fact that they have all this infrastructure in place to create a beautiful setting for live entertainment, whether that would be, let's say, just the NFL games, or if it's something completely different as you see a Beyonce or Travis Scott or Chris Brown, as all of these artists that I've just mentioned have had concerts held in the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in the past couple of years. Sponsorships, the wage control as well. I think Spurs' wages take up less than 50% of the revenue they have in, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's the lowest of any Premier League club. So just to show you that, for all of you Football Manager fans out there, you just could think of it as the textbook version of a long-term save where you're taking the club up from relative financial difficulty to just being fully self-sustaining and able to run and compete for the top four. But with Spurs fans, they will know fully well they have had nothing but on-pitch frustrations for the majority of the tenure. You've got 2 major trophies in 25 years, and that can't be dressed up like it's something that you can consider it's okay or it's nice or it's decent. 2 major trophies in 25 years for a club that is comfortably spoken about as one of the top 6 clubs in the Premier League. That is abysmal. You can't even compare it to any of the trophy hauls of the likes of Arsenal, Manchester United, Manchester City, Liverpool, and Chelsea. And all of these clubs, other than Chelsea, I'd say all of these clubs, and actually no, other than Manchester City especially, in the last, let's say, 15 years, so not the entirety of the 25 years, but just in the last 15 years, none of these clubs have had anything quite close to what you could say a 17-year trophy drought. And they've been in a couple title races. We've seen them lose to Leicester City in an improbable 2016 title race. We've seen the next year as well. They did end up going the distance fighting with Chelsea, but a few games left into the season, they dropped points in a couple of games. Chelsea took the lead and closed it with about a game or 2 to spare in 2017. So other than that, I've not seen Spurs compete for a Premier League title since 2017. And you see where Spurs maybe had reached their footballing peak in reaching their first ever UEFA Champions League final in 2019. What happened? Ended up losing the game 2-0, despite some improbable victories and comebacks against the likes of Manchester City and Ajax in order to get to that final. And then what happened after that? Wasn't necessarily a strong transfer window. Even the transfer window before that to get to the Champions League final, Pochettino, if I'm mistaken, didn't really get money to spend that summer. And then a few months after making it to the Champions League final, Pochettino's let go after a string of poor results to start the next season. And if that does not encapsulate the way that Spurs had been run up until the most recent months, I don't really know what does. And I think a lot of Spurs fans are going to be really frustrated because missing out on multiple league titles and or at least just title challenges, because for the most part, you can never guarantee that you're going to win a trophy, but all you can ask is that the strategy is in place for your team to at least be competitive. And Spurs, for the most part, just haven't been that. And you've had the likes of some all-timer talents as well, not just Premier League talents, but even just in modern history of football. We've seen Gareth Bale at Spurs. We've seen Harry Kane at Spurs. We've seen Heung-min Son at Spurs, Luka Modric. We've seen likes of a Christian Eriksen. You know, you've even had the other talents who maybe they didn't show the level for as long as we probably would have liked to have seen as football fans. But, you know, you've got Dele Alli, you've got Jan Vertonghen at a time. Danny Rose was one of the best fullbacks in the league. Kyle Walker was at the club. You had Hugo Lloris. You had Toby Alderweireld. You had Victor Wanyama was a really decent defensive midfielder as well. And you've had a bunch of players. You had a bunch of role players. Eric Lamela wasn't one of the greatest players, but a decent role player. Nasser Chadli had his moments. You know, there's a bunch of players. There really is a bunch of players that could have helped this team win trophies. And Pochettino, he had Spurs playing some pretty good football. At a time, Spurs were so difficult to beat at home. Didn't necessarily always have the greatest away records under Pochettino, but White Hart Lane, before that stadium switch, they were a stadium where you had to give Spurs their credit. You couldn't go there and easily get wins. So looking at that now, for them to have these players, but then to still have this consistent reluctance to spend big and invest heavily when Spurs were just on the cusp of greatness. Like I said, they had these other title challenges where on paper, they had a better squad than Leicester City that year. They should have beaten Leicester City to the title. It's as simple as that. But then you could easily say any other team should have beaten Leicester City to the title. That was a team that had only just been promoted into the Premier League barely 2 seasons before they had ended up winning it. So for Spurs to have been in that title race and then infamously losing points in the last few games where even Arsenal somehow came out of nowhere and overtook them in the table by the time the 38th game was finished, Spurs ended up finishing 3rd that season in a season where for a couple months they were fighting for the title. How that happens, I don't know. Finishing 3rd in a 2-horse race, I don't know how. But like I said, these types of things have become some sort of an embarrassing attachment that consistently somehow finds Spurs. And I can imagine for Spurs fans out there, it's very easy to put up with some disappointments. But when disappointments are happening every other year, and you'll even have Spurs fans who were livid with the board for sacking Ange Postecoglou after an abysmal Premier League run that does have to be said. Finishing 17th as a Big Six club, that's unheard of. Manchester United finishing just a little bit above them in the table, I would say was the only saving grace for Spurs, that it wasn't them who were suffering as much. But then to beat Manchester United in the Europa League final as well, got to give some credit. They didn't play great football. Neither side played great football in that final, but you have to do what you have to do to win, and it was Spurs that did it on the day. And Postecoglou, despite the lack of confidence that this team would have had because of their poor form in the league, they got it done in Europe. They did get it done in Europe. And for a lot of Spurs fans, I know it didn't sit well with them to have had that time to celebrate with the trophy parade, you know, be very grateful and thank Ange Postecoglou, but then not long after that, he gets sacked. I know a lot of Spurs fans will not be happy with Daniel Levy's actions, even with them winning a trophy this season. And it just has to be said, a number of them are going to be happy to see the back of him. But you have to look at it as he was a great chairman for the books type of situation, but not a great chairman for a trophy cabinet. And I think that just has to be said. Other clubs, you look at the way that Manchester City are run, you look at the way that Liverpool have been run in the last few years, in particular, since Jurgen Klopp has just now left a little bit over a year ago, seeing the kind of moves that they're making. Honestly, you know, the blueprint is there for other football clubs. You know, Manchester United's blueprint at the moment, if I'm just being honest with you, I wouldn't recommend other clubs that are trying to win trophies to do the kind of things that Manchester United have been doing in recent seasons. But Ineos getting a stake in the club, taking the direction of the footballing operations, let's just give them a bit more time to see what they've got there. I don't like to make these kind of concrete judgments too early on when massive changes like things like ownership and, you know, sporting directors and things like that have changed. But with Spurs, I just got to be honest, you know, I'll look at what their future is going to be like. Will Ventukasham, the CEO, and Charrington, who's the new chairman now, shift the club's culture towards a bolder sporting ambition? That's going to be the main question. And to be honest with you, you look at the way that Spurs have been ran, the amount of revenue that they make, the money that they've been making, I've got to be honest, they're in a position where off the pitch, they should be able to make these steps forward and invest more money. But it's hard to say. It's hard to say what they're going to do, because I don't know if Spurs fans' patience have been running so low now that there's that much more that they can take. I think now they've got this euphoria and high of seeing the club take a massive direction, because now you can just dream, you can just imagine what the future can be like, but you know, words are just words. Actions always speak louder than the words. We have to see what Spurs are going to do. And I think for Spurs fans, the bottom line is they expect a lot more trophies this time around. 2 trophies in 25 years. Another 25 years go by. If that's the case again, that's 4 trophies in half a century. That's not going to be put up with for long. There's going to be protests, if not at some point in time, if that kind of run continues. And yeah, I think Spurs fans are going to expect a lot more marquee signings as well. You know, it just goes to be said, the blueprint that Leicester had to win the league, they didn't necessarily have star players, but let's be honest, you had Jamie Vardy, a top 2 scorer in the Premier League. You had N'Golo Kante performing like one of the best midfielders in the Premier League. He ended up winning Premier League Player of the Season a year later with Chelsea, just to give you the type of painting a picture of the caliber of player he was during that mid 2010s era there as well. Riyad Mahrez winning PFA Player of the Year, putting up double digits in goals and assists. He was remarkable. So you can see with Leicester City, even for them, they had the players step up and play like the caliber of players that would be amongst the best in the Premier League. But normally, if you're going to get there, you're just going to have to sign those types of players, either develop them or they're already there themselves. And not one way or another, you're going to have to cough up the money. And I think with Spurs last season, it exemplified where they had been, where they did make a marquee signing in Dominic Solanke, but then other than that, it was mostly focusing on signing young talents. And I do think a club that wants to try and win things, that's not going to be the best way to go. You know, you've got to find some type of balance. So having one major senior player come in and then everyone else, a youngster that needs to try and find their way at the top level, that's not going to help you win trophies. So I think Spurs moving forward, you know, even though they've made the Tel loan permanent, but doing things like signing Mohamed Kudus, doing things like where you're chasing Eberechi Eze, but you don't get him, so you go ahead and get Xavi Simons. These are big moves. These are players who, they're not old players, they're not in their prime years, but they're players who have shown in their limited time that they're ready for that step up. Mohamed Kudus, the end product and scoring a lot more, I think has always been the big talking point about him, but his ability to play good football in the Premier League, I don't think that's been in doubt. He didn't necessarily have the best last season with West Ham this past campaign, but I think he's a player who can show he's got what it takes. You've got Xavi Simons as well. He's another player who he's just on the cusp of breaking into that top level as an attacking midfield / winger option. I think he's been really exciting for Leipzig the couple of years he's been there, and his loan spell in the Dutch league as well. He was on fire. He was a top scorer, you know, as a 19-year-old playing in that league. So, you know, it just goes to show Xavi Simons is a great signing for Spurs. That's the type of signing that Spurs should be trying to do more of, trying to make that type of signing every summer. Maybe they may do it now that there is going to be a change in leadership. So that was that one. The other big talking point I wanted to dive into is player power and transfer ethics. So this is one that I expect to be a bigger talking point over the coming weeks as well. I think we've only just seen a little bit of chatter about it since deadline day has passed. And it's basically the Guéhi way of doing things versus the Isak / Wissa / Gyokeres way of doing things. So for those of you that aren't in the know, Marc Guéhi, in my opinion, he handled the summer like a model professional. I think many people will agree with that. Please let me know in the comment section if you're watching this on YouTube. Do you think Marc Guéhi behaved in the way that all players should behave? And whilst we're at it, if you have been enjoying the video so far, please like the video. If you're listening on any audio platforms, I would really appreciate you giving me a 5 stars. But if I haven't yet earned that in your opinion, just please give me a bit more time and hopefully I will. Please like, please share with any of your friends, family, friends, any of your pets even. If your pets have neighbors, please share it with them as well. Anyone who loves football, please, I'd really appreciate if you share the podcast with them as well. But just going a bit deeper into this, Marc Guéhi, he did stay quiet throughout the summer. He does have social media, but we didn't see anything on his stories or any vague posts that were attention-provoking or anything like that, or attention-seeking or anything like that. He kept training. He didn't miss any training. He didn't make life difficult for his manager. I think, interestingly, with Marc Guéhi as well, you've got to keep in mind that Liverpool and Crystal Palace played each other in the Community Shield, and he was already linked with Liverpool even before that Community Shield game this past August had even been played. But he had a big role in that game to play, started the game, helped the club go as far into it as possible, and they ended up winning on penalties as well. So that was another title for Crystal Palace to win. And of course, he's the captain of the club who had an unbelievable, a famous run this past campaign. You've got the likes of Ismail Assar and Eberechi Eze. You've got Mateta as well, who were absolutely unbelievable helping Crystal Palace win it. But you can look at players all over the side, none the least in Marc Guéhi as well, who helped make that FA Cup dream possible. Playing against Manchester City, one of the best teams in the world. They didn't really play like it last season, but you look at Manchester City over these last several years, they are one of the best teams in the world. They did have a bit of an anomaly last year. For Palace to face that caliber of team and win their first ever major trophy, absolutely insane. So you can see why Crystal Palace were not in a rush to get rid of their captain, because he's someone who still in his prime footballing years, or is approaching his prime footballing years. He's a very valuable leader, brilliant influence in the changing room. He's the kind of player that you wouldn't want to leave, but he's heading into the last year of his contract. There are rumours that if now he's not moved to any club in the summer, he could still move to another club in January. But I've already seen some reports that the likes of Real Madrid, Bayern Munich and Barcelona are now all keeping tabs on Marc Guéhi as well, as he's now looking to be a free agent next summer. And it doesn't look like he's going to renew with Crystal Palace. So no matter what, I don't expect him to be a Crystal Palace player beyond this season. But the outcome here is that Palace kept him. The deal collapsed in the final hours. I also heard some reports that Palace's owner and chairman had some type of fitness class in the middle of the afternoon in central London. And, you know, that was part of the reason why there was a delay in him being able to sit down with Guéhi and his representatives. That one, I'm going to say, is probably just speculation. In football, the craziest things happen. So you can't even say there's no chance it happened, but it just goes to show there was a mess in the way that this was handled. I wouldn't, like I said, it was more of a deal that Liverpool needed to get it done. Ibrahima Konate did come off injured against Arsenal in their most recent Premier League game, but you know, let's just be honest. Crystal Palace didn't need to sell. Even if they let him go for free, there might have been a bit more value in keeping Guéhi for the season rather than cashing in for £35 million now, or even a potential £25 million or £30 million in January if they're open to negotiations again. But it does raise the question, does being a professional and towing the line, is that really a good strategy for a footballer in this modern era? Is it really a good strategy? Because to be honest, Guéhi didn't get his move. It just has to be said, he did not get his move. And, you know, did him being a professional and not causing problems cost him that big move? Because Liverpool, with the signings they've made this season, had you brought in Marc Guéhi, I'd have honestly said that was a 10 out of 10 window. They had addressed all of their problems. Any area that you would have thought Liverpool could have been lacking in, had they signed Guéhi, they were totally stacked. I would even say without Guéhi, they're the favourites for the Premier League. We'll get into that a bit later, but I do have to look at this and think to myself, wow, had they signed him, I don't see anybody catching Liverpool to the Premier League title this season. But now, if we just look at the contrasts, let's look at the player uprising. So there were 3 particularly big examples, even though there were a lot more strikes going on that I don't feel like really got media coverage. But I think that just goes to show players in question who have quality and are in demand, they get more of the spotlight on their actions. So to me, you had the likes of Alejandro Garnacho, wasn't training with the squad, but I felt like that seemed to be mutual. Manchester United having him train solo. You had Anthony at Manchester United, Jadon Sancho at Manchester United. All of these players were not training with the squad, but then just about got deals happening either on deadline day or the day before deadline day. But I didn't hear that much media coverage or fan criticism about those players. The players who I were hearing about all the time were Victor Gyokeres early on in the transfer window. He was skipping training at Sporting Lisbon to force a move to the Gunners. And he even declared at one point in time that he would never play again for Sporting Lisbon. We were seeing all types of back and forth between executives at Sporting Lisbon saying that there were no verbal agreements in place for Victor Gyokeres, and if they were to let him go, it would be for much more money than the reported £60 million that were, you know, the links being bid by either Manchester United or an Arsenal or anybody else that wanted Victor Gyokeres. But what apparently Gyokeres' agent and representatives were saying were that Gyokeres did have an agreement with Sporting Lisbon to leave at the end of the season, and if a fair offer of what ended up being the amount of money that Arsenal did end up paying to sign him was to come onto the table, he'd be allowed to go. But Sporting Lisbon were making that much more difficult at the time. In the end, though, Victor Gyokeres did get his move to Arsenal. He's now the main man in the number 9 position for now at Arsenal, and that was the move he always wanted. And it just has to be said, you now look at his Swedish countryman in Alexander Isak, the biggest transfer saga of the whole window. We had seen all types of reports with Alexander Isak. You know, somewhere in the middle of July, we had seen where he didn't go in on Newcastle United's Asia tour in pre-season. The reports initially of that day were that Alexander Isak had an injury, and then on the same day, Craig Hope, one of the biggest Newcastle United related journalists, did break the news that Alexander Isak had told Newcastle United that he wanted to explore a move away from the club. Even then, Newcastle United were not playing ball. They rejected outhand a £110 million offer from Liverpool that followed up soon after that, saying that they wanted their valuation of £150 million to be met, or Isak stays. He's got 3 years left on his contract. They went in a rush to sell him. But Isak, from his behaviour, I always got the feeling something else had been going on behind the scenes, because Isak played such a pivotal role in such a memorable season for Newcastle United last campaign. He scored 27 goals in all competitions, scored over 20 Premier League goals in back-to-back seasons. He's aesthetically, the way that he plays the ball, the way that he plays the game, the way that he makes his runs without the ball, the way he links up play. He just looks like a fantastic striker and looks like one of the best strikers in Europe. But Newcastle United just about finished in the top 5. They did get Champions League football, so they did manage to get their objective and also win a Carabao Cup as well, with Alexander Isak scoring the winning goal in the final against Liverpool. You know, I think Isak thought that his work had been done, that he'd done everything he could do with Newcastle United. I think Newcastle United, with Isak or without him, are not in the mix for the Premier League title race, and they're not in the mix to win the Champions League, if I'm being honest with you, even if they've qualified. So Isak, in his mid-20s now, he just wants to make that move and get to the next stage. And in the end, he just fought and fought all summer to make it happen. The PFA Player and Team Awards had been taking place not too recently. You know, I'd covered this in my previous podcast episode as well, that he had an Instagram story outburst accusing the club of broken promises, and that he had made his position clear even before last season had ended, that he wanted to move on in the summer. Newcastle United eventually, just in the night before deadline day, accepted a £125 million offer from Liverpool. Reports are saying that it's going to be increased to £130 million, but give or take, it's at the £125 to £130 million ballpark. Finally, on deadline day, the biggest transfer that's ever happened in the Premier League between British clubs, or even just any British club signing a player, had finally taken place. And now Liverpool got their man, and Isak got the move that he wanted. But also in the Premier League, a story that had been linked to that one was Wissa joining Newcastle United from Brentford. Again, that was one that finally managed to get done on deadline day. But it was another one that we had seen. Wissa had a great season, scoring 19 Premier League goals last season. He was exceptional for Brentford, not just that season, but even, in my opinion, the seasons before. He's been with them in the Premier League. He's been so good. He's been so reliable. He took his game to another level last season, and look at, he was ready to go. Brentford, they had different ideas. They didn't want to let him go. They didn't want to let him go to Newcastle United, and they definitely didn't want to let him go on the cheap. Later on, Wissa released an Instagram story of his own, making a statement saying that he did have an agreement with Brentford in place, that if a fair offer came on the table, they wouldn't stand in his way to allow him to go. But then there ended up being a change of plans, and he didn't feel like it was fair. He didn't feel like it was right. He had also been skipping training throughout the summer as well. He hadn't featured for Brentford in the Premier League yet so far this season. And in the end, Newcastle United, with a £55 million bid, they managed to get it done on deadline day. And now they had their new striker to join Nick Watermart, who was just about finalised a few days before deadline day. So when you look at it, there's big questions that arise from this. You know, you see someone who behaved like a model professional, as I keep saying, but he doesn't get his move. He doesn't get the dream move that he wants. And now he potentially misses out on winning some big trophies with Liverpool if they go on to do what is expected of them. Let's see if he joins in January. That is still on the cards. Please let me know in the comment section. Do you see Marc Guéhi staying at Crystal Palace beyond January, or do you see him moving in that window? But you now have to think about this. Do clubs now only respond when players apply pressure? Because in that case of Guéhi, it did look like it screamed, he's not putting pressure on Crystal Palace to sell him. He's not causing a muck. He's not creating problems. Right now, if they don't sell him, they'll be fine. But we'll have to see if Marc Guéhi responds like a model professional and keep playing well, keep doing his job as a captain. But I'm sure he's going to be very annoyed at somebody at Crystal Palace that move didn't go through. And now you also have to ask, is professionalism punished while disruptive behavior gets results? From what I've seen this summer, I think punished is a harsh word to say, but let's be honest. If your dream is to have that big move to a club that can win and compete for the biggest titles, and you don't get it, for all Marc Guéhi knows, another centre-back might come into the picture for Liverpool. They go ahead and get him above him. And then, he's still linked with other big clubs. So I'm sure Marc Guéhi would get a big move regardless, whether that be in January or next summer as a free agent. But if he wanted Liverpool in particular, the clock is ticking there. The window might be closing. You never know what happens in football. So I'm sure he's going to be thinking that he's been punished, even though he's been absolutely helpful with Crystal Palace all the way. And you just have to think about it. What does this now mean for the future of football transfer sagas? Will we see more players follow the Guéhi route or the Isak, Wissa and Gyokeres route? I think the latter is going to be the case. We're going to see a lot more bad behavior from players next summer or even in January as well. And I think it's going to be something that might spiral out of control if we don't get some type of understanding put in place between players and football clubs. Because I know you have a contract. Not everybody's contract has a release clause. And even with some players who have release clauses in their contract, it doesn't activate until a certain year. It might only be active for a certain amount of time. Players and clubs have to do a bit of give and take. And I do think for any football club, especially at the top level, it's never going to be helpful for you to hold players against your will. Because the last thing you need now is a player who is a key player, but they're not giving it their all in training and in games, because now their head has been turned. They've lost faith in the management or in the people that run the club because they weren't given the move that they wanted. Especially when players and agents think, oh, this fee that's now just come in for me is a fair offer, whilst the club might think the opposite. So, I think fans should be respectful of Guéhi for what he did as a captain for Crystal Palace. I think he genuinely behaved like such a brilliant captain. And to me, I couldn't have respected him more. But now it does remain to see how is he going to respond to this. Because now I'm not expecting Guéhi to be playing the nice guy role just as easily now when January comes around. I think he's going to put his foot down and demand a transfer. Does it damage the game if forcing moves becomes the only way to get big transfers done? Yes, it will. I think we're going to see a lot more media circuses in the future, a lot more speculation, a lot more headlines and this and that and all these kind of stories coming out about players in the future. Because now I think players are going to see, for Isak, it works. For Gyokeres, it works. For Wissa, it did work. So for Guéhi, if I want to try and be a good professional and maintain my relationship with the fans, might that come at the cost of me getting my dream move? I think that's going to be a very big talking point over the coming months and maybe just 12 months as well, heading into the next World Cup. So that's all the drama in the boardrooms and behind the scenes of the transfer market. What does it actually mean for this season, though? Let's take a look at how Liverpool, Spurs, Arsenal, and the FA Cup holders, Crystal Palace, are shaping up now that the dust has settled. With Isak joining Liverpool, are they the instant favourites? How does that attacking trio line up? You've got Hugo Ekitike starting on fire. He scored 3 goals in his first 3 games, including the Community Shield as well. He was really helpful. He didn't have that great of a game against Arsenal, if I'm being honest with you. He did have a goal that was ruled out rightfully for offside, but he's going to be a hard player to drop. Cody Gakpo as well got a couple of assists at St. James's Park in that victory against Newcastle United as well. He's been really good as well. He's been in really good form on the left wing. You've got Mo Salah, not in the best form to start the season, but he has 1 goal and 1 assist as well. So it's not like he's playing terribly. So you look at Alexander Isak, he's going to find it difficult to get into this Liverpool team, even though he's a record signing. But, let's not be around the bush. It just has to be said. When you sign a player of that caliber, he's supposed to be starting games. But I do feel like there won't be too much trouble for Liverpool. I think last season you saw Liverpool run out of steam a little bit as they had, I wouldn't say limped their way to the title, but with such a big gap that they had throughout most of that season, and then getting knocked out in the Champions League. And then in the same week, they got knocked out of the Champions League at around the 16th stage. They then lost the Carabao Cup final to Newcastle United. So, let's just be honest. That Liverpool team did need a bit more, even though they won the Premier League with such a healthy points margin. And I do think with Alexander Isak coming in, it's important to remember the amount of attackers that Liverpool had lost. They've sold Darwin Núñez to Saudi Arabia, Al Hilal. They've sold Luis Diaz to Bayern Munich. Diogo Jota, unfortunately, had passed away in the summer. So heading into this season, the only strikers or attackers that remained from last season were either Mohamed Salah and Cody Gakpo. So to now just bring in Hugo Ekitike and Alexander Isak, you've really got about 4 options. Even though you've got Federico Chiesa still at the club, but he barely played last season. He just didn't make the UEFA Champions League squad list for Liverpool now. Rio Ngomora, a 16-year-old winger, did. He looks to be getting a lot more opportunities this season. He's already repaid that faith with that stoppage time winner against Newcastle United the other day. And I do have to say, Liverpool with about 5 senior attacking players and Rio Ngomora, an academy graduate, is looking to be getting a bit more time in the team. You would think maybe on paper they could be a little bit light, but I'll be honest, the quality and the experience of the players they already have, and with Mohamed Salah, in my opinion, I think he's the best attacker in the league anyway. You've got him, you've got Alexander Isak. This is going to be a frightening team. This is a team that should be winning the Premier League, but as I've said in a previous short that you may see on my YouTube channel or my TikTok channel, I do think now with Isak now joining the club, they should be in the mix for the Champions League as well. They shouldn't be getting knocked out in the round of 16 with the signings they've made this season. And I do think they're going to be in the mix to win multiple trophies this season. So let's see if they can do that. With Spurs, will this new leadership translate into riskier transfers or a fresh trophy push? That's going to be really difficult to say because I need to see more than just Daniel Levy leaving. I need to see what the strategy is going to be like for Spurs. Are they going to be more active in January windows now when things aren't going as well in the first half of the season? Are they going to be doing more marquee summer signings on a consistent basis? I really don't know. It's so hard to say at this stage. I think we need to see more details come out. But, it's natural. It's a breaking story that Daniel Levy has left the club. So I'll be honest. I'm okay to just let that play out how it is. But with Thomas Frank being brought in as the new manager, I thought that was an astute acquisition. I like the kind of football he's got Spurs playing recently. They did play some dire football against Bournemouth most recently in their 1-0 loss at home. But I'm willing to let that be a little bit of an anomaly because they played very well against Manchester City in the game before. But then in the game before that, they played against a promoted team in Burnley, tore them apart 3-0. But then that's a team that I expect to be in the mix to get relegated at the end of the season. So at the moment, it's a bit back and forth. Even the way they played against PSG, in my opinion, the best team in the world in the UEFA Super Cup, they were winning that game 2-0 for a while. They were playing pretty decent football, but then in the final minutes of that game, they capitulated and then they ended up losing on penalties. Again, that's something that has now become a little bit familiar with Spurs over the years. Things are going well for a while, then right at the final moment, when it's so crucial to hold on, it doesn't quite work. So even under Thomas Frank, and with these big signings like Mohamed Kudus and Xavi Simons, Palhinha on loan, I think is a great signing. It remains to be seen what Spurs are going to do. But I do think Spurs fans have every reason to think they could be having a fresh direction now. With Arsenal, I want to think, does Piero Hincapié, another defensive option for Arsenal, help boost things for them? Yeah, I do. I think for Arsenal, this is a really underrated signing because this is the type of signing that they hadn't done too much of in recent years, even though they have been bringing a lot of defenders. But you've seen the likes of Calafiori get injured last season. Miles Lewis-Skelly was just promoted into the first team last season. He wasn't playing left back as an academy player, but he has really grown into that role in the Arsenal first team as of last season. They've let go of Zinchenko. They've still got Ben White, who, again, injury problems. William Saliba's had some injury problems recently. He's out injured at the moment as well. So really, you've got Gabriel, who can play centre-back. You've got Timber, who can play right-back and centre-back. Now you're bringing Hincapié, who can play on that left full-back side or as a centre-back too. So I think for Arsenal, it was a signing that putting that much money towards another defensive option, I think some Arsenal fans will be quite frustrated with that. They might have felt like other areas of the pitch needed that strengthening even more. But at the end of the day, a high-profile rotational option, that's the type of move that Manchester City make. And we've seen with Manchester City the type of success they've had in the last few years, winning so many titles because they have strong benches usually. Even though they're in a rebuild period now, Arsenal now, they're strengthening their team. Their team this season looks stronger than last season. I expect them to be in the title race again. So, what this does with Guéhi staying at the club, I think Crystal Palace should be fine at least halfway into the season. They've got a really strong back five, one of the best defenses in the Premier League. They should be really good. But please just let me know, do you think Levy's departure with Spurs gives them a real chance to compete in the future? Or is it just window dressing for now? And is Isak really worth £130 million? Is he really worth that British transfer record? Please let me know below in the comment section or anywhere else that you may be watching this video. And I would really appreciate it if you let me know your hot takes. I'll try and feature the best ones in the next episode from what you guys have been saying. And now just my closing thoughts here. I'm really happy with how this has gone. You know, how I see it is really that there's a lot to look forward to in the Premier League this season. I think there's going to be a lot of great things for us to be able to watch. And I just want to say thank you so much for everyone that took the time to watch or listen to this episode. And that's it. That's the end of episode 2 of World Football Onslaught podcast. We've covered Levy's dramatic Spurs exit, Messi's emotional farewell, and a transfer deadline day that had just about everything. Next week, or the next time that I'll be able to upload, we're going to see how all these stories actually played out on the pitch once the international break is over. You know, we'll see if Isak's done well on his debut at Liverpool. We'll see how Arsenal's new look defence has gone and what Spurs look like in the post-Levy era. So please make sure you subscribe. I just want to say lastly again, please share the content. If you liked it, please like and subscribe and give your opinions in the comments. I'll be featuring some of the best ones in the next one. But until then, I'm Will. This has been the Will's Football Onslaught podcast. Thank you so much. Keep your boots laced, and I'll see you next time.